Supradeep, I think we are live. We can start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Supradeep Das, a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I welcome you all at today's Wednesday seminar. I am the master of ceremonies for today's session. The topic of today's seminar is China's securitization of political questions and foreign policy, navigating complexities. We have seen that China follows a securitization strategy approach aimed at legitimizing its historical claims while questioned through the political issues. This is also linked with its foreign policy. Through today's discussion, we will also get to know about how China analyzes the narratives of historical claims and concerns through political settlement, domestication, national integration, balancing local, political, and economical culture and social governance. This seminar will also offer an alternative understanding of China's securitization strategy in navigating the complexities of historical claims and security concerns in aspects of geopolitics. Our speaker for today's discussion is Mr. Doku Nagamalleshwara Rao, who is a research assistant at the Center for Land Warfare Studies in New Delhi. His research focuses on China, East Asia, and the Indo-Pacific region. Currently, he is pursuing his PhD from Shantung University, China, where he is researching on strategic culture influence on China's approaches to international security and order. Today's session will be chaired by Mr. Manoj Keval Ramani. Mr. Keval Ramani is the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Research Program and the China Studies Fellow at the Takshashila Institution, Bengaluru. One of his recent publications includes Smokeless War, China's Quest for Domestic um, Smokeless War, China's Quest for Domestic Geopolitical Dominance, published by Bloomsbury, India in 2021, which discusses on China's political, diplomatic, economic, and narrative responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. His research interests includes Chinese politics, foreign policy approaches to new technologies, and addressing questions on how India can work with the like-minded partners to deal with the challenges emerged by China's rise. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to request all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All the participants will be muted during the seminar. Questions can be posted in the chat box, or you can also use the raise hand option to ask your questions during the Q&A session. You shall be then called upon to unmute yourself and ask your question. I shall now hand over the floor to Mr. Keval Ramani to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Supradeep. I want to begin by thanking ICS and Professor Acharya for inviting me and asking me to chair the session. It's truly a pleasure to be talking about some of these things. I don't want to take too much time away from the presentation. I want us to go to the presentation. But I wanted to make three quick points on the idea of securitization as part of Chinese policies. We're going to be talking about foreign policy and political issues today. But this is a broader trend in overall Chinese governance over the last decade that we have seen. A few months ago, 6-8 months ago, you had the 20th Party Congress in October last year. And I remember the conversations after that were all around how many times did Xi Jinping mention security in the speech. So we've been looking at this sort of shift that has been taking place. For years now, we've had this comprehensive or overall or holistic national security concept that under Xi Jinping that has come into be. There's been lots of research done on that. And essentially the idea is that across the board, every aspect of governance under this national security concept is being looked at from the lens of security, with political security being at the top of everything. And if you read through how provincial leaders in China have been discussing their interpretations and their implementation of this comprehensive national security concept, it just tells you that there is an overall securitization of everything, whether it is from basic grassroots governance to whether it is ideological, the need to create greater ideological conformity, to whether it is to about how markets function and what is the intervention of the state or the party also in the markets, to the role of the party across society. And everything is therefore being looked at from the lens of security. And therefore, in this context, particularly in a world where foreign policy is much more deeply interlinked with domestic policy and with economic policy, you're going to see these elements of securitization bleed into all different domains. So that's the first point that I wanted to make, that I think this is a fundamental shift that has taken place, and it is across the board, whether it is about basic issues about energy to food. Everything is viewed as predominantly from a security lens as opposed to necessarily a growth, development, prosperity lens. Even the idea of common prosperity that Xi Jinping has talked about, it has been looked at predominantly from a security lens. The second point that I wanted to make is that on economic policy, and the linkages to this to foreign policy, and I don't know if Doku's presentation will actually be talking about this. I think it's much more focused on political issues, but we are seeing the implications and the trade-offs of this securitization of overall policy in the last few months in particular. Over the last few years, we've seen a bunch of new Chinese legislation, whether it was the cybersecurity law, the anti-espionage law, which has just been amended, the data security law, the anti-foreign sanctions law. We've seen this raft of legislation which have essentially prioritized a security lens over all these engagements. So whether it is over data flow. And over the last few weeks, we've seen the implications of some of this, particularly because some of these laws don't necessarily define these critical concepts very clearly, as opposed to, for example, what exactly does national security imply when it comes to the counter-espionage law? What activities impinge on national security and how? And therefore, we will see an editor or a senior journalist being detained for having engagements with foreign diplomats. We might see academics come under pressure, and we are obviously currently seeing consultancy firms in China facing pressure. So I think that these challenges are likely to increase. Likewise, in data security, the data security legislation talks about important data and control over important data, but it doesn't necessarily define what important data means. And part of this is that because these are difficult questions to come up with clear definitions. But once you've got a securitized lens, which is looking at all of this predominantly from a security perspective, and obviously the security apparatus is responding in the way it is currently responding, you end up in a position where you have a chilling effect on economic activity, which therefore impacts what is Xi Jinping's other primary objective, development. He often talks about how development and security are dialectically linked, but clearly these are two distinct goals that seem to be emerging, and there is a contradiction in how they are pursuing these goals. And again, all of these actions that are happening at home have also a foreign policy implication, given the perceptions with regard to containment and suppression that China believes the US is carrying out. So that's the second aspect of it, that increasing securitized approach is going to have an impact on development, but it's also going to have an impact on external relations and likely to worsen China's external relations even further. The final point that I want to make before I pass on to Doku and I want to hear his presentation is around the Global Security Initiative, which again, I think it sort of encapsulates this, when it comes to foreign affairs, the securitization of foreign policy. And I've said quite a bit about the Global Security Initiative in the past, but I would just like to say that to me, this is a securitization of all Chinese foreign activities, whether it is people-to-people engagement, whether it is economic engagement, whether it is law enforcement engagement, which to me is a primary component of what GSI will entail, to whether it is engaging in conflict zones and things like that. And I think that to me is going to be the framework within which we're likely to see Chinese foreign policy evolve going forward. With that, like I said, I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation, and I would like to pass it on to Doku. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. First, I would like to express my gratitude to Honorary Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, uh, Professor Alka, for giving me the opportunity to speak at the ICS Wednesday seminar. I would also like to convey best wishes from the DG Clause, and I thank them for the in-house arrangements for this talk. And it is also my pleasure uh, to see Manoj Keval Ramani here. Uh, in the past, we had some discussions on how contrast life in China during his time and to my recent experience. And this, I hope to take this discussion into a similar veins. I'll explain my format, how I would like to do it. In these 30 minutes, I prefer to keep the discussion in a conversation way by asking questions. To my intention, it will brainstorm not just me and also the audience to pose more questions at my presentation. Uh, I believe this model could explain us to understand what's the development happening in China and keep the audience engaged. So in these 6 sets, we have a introduction and then historical claims, then political questions, later in the stage, how securitization is happening around the political questions, and what China thinks of the complexities involved in these questions, and how China is pursuing uh, ahead. So, one to assess what is the importance of political questions, we have to look back to what story China is telling to the world about these historical claims. I came across in internal discussions in China um, how we classify Xi Jinping's rule is much different than what Chinese classify. They call 2013 to 2023 as a era of Xi Jinping, and then now this is a new era which may last for 5 years or one more decade. So, coming to the introduction, one of my favorite question all the time is since I have a background from the international relations, so I look at things from the international relations to domestic things happening. So I see what is happening in China's foreign policy and why some of these events are linked to political questions. And then the second question that I'm very much fond of, and then particularly that made me to work on this topic, was how have once historical claims became political now. So in this argument, I was trying to explain like how China has brought a political angle to the historical claims. It's mostly when we see events related to these questions like rule for diplomacy or positions papers publishing, Chinese debate on merits of China model, or engaging in a discussion explaining the disadvantages of non-Chinese models, particularly from the West, are linked to these questions. And then we also see digital media and social media posts on unrest in Hong Kong, cynicization of Tibetan culture, political military associations in Taiwan Strait. All of these have direct link to situation, what is happening inside China. Here we need to divide China into a core and periphery, so that to under in the core, as Keval Ramani said, the it is more about law and order. But in the periphery, it is not just law and order. Law and order is one of the means, but securitization in the periphery, all these conflict issues are more about securitizing this area. So, in my opinion, these can only understood by the domestic determinants of Chinese foreign policy. And moving on to the second question, China sees these historical claims um, as a sovereign claims, but it is from the selective readings of what Chinese texts or archaeological evidences says. Uh, but but for me, this is different. I see there are three phases in securitizing these historical claims. At first stage, China looked into selective reading, which is I talked about, and in the second stage, it is more. It has attempted to find a political ground for its claims through elite settlements measures to domestication, releasing position papers or white papers on Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, human rights, Hong Kong, most of these issues. But this process of right now, the process is not just about securitization. It's about bringing more laws to get more legal ground to China's historical claims. So through that, as Sir said, what I remember is this: the anti-succession law, which is which says in some sentences um, the intention or thought of going independence is a kind of uh, taboo. And in the final question, which I believe is why China choose to um securitize these areas. Uh, and I remember a story which a Han Chinese friend was telling when I was in China. I asked him, where does the CCP gets its legitimacy from? The answer was like, as long as we get the economic progress, there is no need to question the party's authority. This is very convincing for me because the social contract between party and the Chinese people was centered around improvement of economic situation, dignity of life, and social order. But however, there is a contract between the party and the newly acquired territories in 1940s and 1950s. Each case has a different and unique way. Way. For example, in Hong Kong, the formula was to approach with one China, one country, and two systems. While in Tibet, it is non-interference in religious affairs, and in Xinjiang, it is more of social practices and religious practices. Uh, Here, what China is looking for is even the Keval Ramani said that it is about political security and the regime security. Legitimacy is the one that gives whether you are secure enough or not. The intention behind all these securitization measures is to gain more legitimacy over its claims in the longer run. So the objective for 100 years of the party and the China is to show to the world that the 100 years these areas are stable here under China, and there is no, if there is a tomorrow a civil war or any other issues, this would help China to put more standardize its claims. So let me go to the historical claims. So now I guess we have a common understanding on what are these historical claims. Uh, I would like to take you back to the founding days of PRC when the Mao was giving a speech on October 1st, 1949. He was talking about New China. This would explore the connection because this new China concept in Chinese discourse is more important because it talks about the issues that happened in the past and then not repeating those same mistakes in CCP's leadership. So as a researchers, but we need to understand these historical claims are different from political claims and legal claims because each stage, the more you have a control and the more you have the more you brought a legal and other measures, security measures, to ensure that this area is not contested. That explains a lot of what China is doing right now. But I also see what went wrong in building Chinese nation state. Uh, I believe Mao's initial experiments with communes and other system hasn't much worked because uh, the society in China is little different than what the Leninist and Marxist um, ideas have been propagated. But additionally, what is the interesting thing that I take note of is success stories of Mao's China. One is about political will to either to initiate military campaigns in Tibet or Xinjiang, or a courage to start intervention in Taiwan Straits, or unchallenged authority to attack a neighbor in 1962. Most importantly, this is what I see is Mao's political will was um, has a two characters, either to assert or to compromise. So he was the only one leader who could have who had gone to compromise on the territorial disputes, where the 11 dash line was shrink to 9 dash line in the South China Sea dispute. But if I see right current state, what is the political will of the core leadership, which is Xi Jinping and his seven other Politburo members? I see they have potential to assert claims, but Xi Jinping himself has a limitations within the party to compromise on these issues. That is one of my assessment. Okay, and there is one another debate which I have been hearing in most of the books depicting Xi Jinping as a new Mao. So I asked the same question again: is Xi Jinping another Mao? But for me, the answer is certainly not, because his power is limited to pragmatically go for any dispute settlement with compromise. So that is the reason why he goes for proactively escalating tensions. So another regarding the political questions, framing historical claims as a territorial claims uh, has started in the when the China has brought out the core national interest concept. That is right now we are talking about holistic national interest, national security interest, but that this has a background which comes from the core national interest. In the core national interest, we also see developmental interest, overseas interest as a part of uh, China's security interest. So this explains what China is doing through nation building efforts. Uh, they have made political questions to synonyms to national security interests. So that's where it becomes difficult for the stakeholders, others like India and other uh, countries who have disputes with China, unable to uh, project our stand on it, because China brings the national security within the uh, discourse. So it becomes when you have a red lines. That's what I was when Keval Ramanisa was talking about holistic national interest or national security interest, holistic securitization. I felt if if China is doing this way, how could the discussions go ahead? I guess if you say everything is holistic, all the issues should be through or see from these lens. There is no way we could go for negotiations. So what if I'm strong, then my way is the right way. So that is what happening in China, diplomacy between China and other neighboring countries who has territorial disputes. So now one more thing why China looks for legitimacy over these questions is there has been various uh, groups on these various groups with various views on these issues. A set of countries acknowledge, but they do not recognize what China's claims are. Some odd 15 countries go with Taiwan's argument, and very few stands with the responsibility to settle the dispute between the stakeholders, which is a Bhutan, a case of Bhutan. But most importantly, what we need to focus is on China's neighbors who has disputes. The Chinese story, what Chinese have been explaining is these neighbors have been acknowledging what China's positions are at every stage, but they have been engaged in undermining China's claims. Particularly, like this is important thing because uh, our, the interest of Chinese in this dispute is contested. So Chinese discussions doesn't allow this contestation. What is China's solution to it? If we go back to the age-old saying from Chinese sayings, I remember this one: the long united must be divided, and the long divided must be united. This narrative fits into the recent narrative of century of humiliation, where uh, it gets more weight on how China manages its periphery. Uh, the solution China is looking is to manage internal disturbances and external interference through stability. We're talking about legitimacy. How China, if we look back to the initial phrases China Xi Jinping used to uh, uh, put in his policy was stability maintenance. So for me, I see there is a link between the interest to gain more legitimacy to and the aspiration to bring a kind of stability within the country, within the core and periphery both. Uh, so that makes them to go for more securitized with all the measures that could be taken. For me, the definition for securitization is a framing an issue or policy as existential threat to country, allowing government to take extraordinary measures beyond normal political process, which allows them to take. So there, I identified five ways to ways and means China go consider the securitization process, which are political settlements, domestication, and national integration, balance of political and economic culture, social governance. These five aspects have subtopics, sub measures that China has been using. So there might be changes in one or other. Like usually, right now the focus is more on online censorship, but it would come under enhancing state censorship. So some of the issues which I have left would be under the broader uh, definition of these measures. So now let me go to the fifth section. What I identified was three findings in my presentation, uh, uh, in my research. China has a kind of, not a kind of strategy, but there are some ways China has been navigating these complexities. Uh, China's So the first one measure, the overall measure is to bring political settlement, which involves engaging in dialogue with neutral parties and finding common ground through compromise. But this compromise is very tricky one because whether I'm compromising or whether you are compromising. So another one is refers to the domestication, uh, refers to the process of incorporating and assimilating diverse cultures into not just into Chinese idea of culture, like the holistic culture. It's also in the polity and economy. In each sector of a society, China has started this domestication. And then what is interesting, and another interesting way China manages this complexity is putting the national integration process that it hasn't been uh, fully accomplished. So that means it could get more public support, and then it could bring more resources to achieve or to put China's claim at higher grounds. So in some cases, but China may use persuasion or asymmetric power relations or measures to intimidate or use the force. So, okay, what these measures translate into are like they could be economic sanctions. Best case was Australia, and military buildup and assertive actions to reinforce its claims. So coming to the findings, I have five findings which explains China's security debates are deeply involved, sorry, deeply intertwined with foreign. I'm getting cough. Okay, sorry for the disturbance. Um, yeah, first finding is about China's security debates are deeply intertwined with its foreign policy, and its foreign policy documents reflect that aspect. Like each document puts even the statements or the commentaries from the weekly briefing asserts China's claims at one point or another. Second, China has found use of these white papers to clarify positions and on political questions. Usually, it could be one white paper, but as the events happening in those areas, China would start bringing the new stories about what China's story is about. Third finding is China seeks to handle security concerns in a very diplomatic way if the conditions help China to negotiate from the higher ground. Otherwise, the most traditional way is to use securitization measures. Fourth is about there is also a shift from traditional security to more holistic approach, and which encompasses economic, environmental, social, uh, each aspect of governing society and the state. Finally, China is also pushing its perspectives on political questions globally, which can be seen in its foreign policy. And yeah, I conclude.
Thank you so much, Doku. I think that was really quite comprehensive in terms of looking at not just how historically the Chinese party state has been looking at issues of territorial disputes, but also political questions which have security implications, but also in terms of what kind of actions have been taken and what kind of a toolkit we've seen deployed over the years and more recently also. I want to ask everybody if there are questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat box, and I'd be happy to post them. But before I sort of pass on to anybody else, I had two thoughts, and I wanted to get clarity from you on that. Firstly, I think I lost a little bit of the audio when you were talking about Mao and Xi Jinping and the comparison. So if you could just clarify a little bit on what do you see as differences and what do you see as similarities in terms of their approach to these issues. If you could start with that, and then I'll come to the next question.
What is the basic difference between the times when China was initially becoming a nation state and right now? In China, the power is mostly not at the elite party circles. So within the party circles, there is a lot of power shifts, like the various fractions trying to assert their own influence on party's decision making. But regarding these political questions, what the similarity that I see is a political will to assert on these disputes. But what is the thing that I haven't been seeing is during Mao's time, he has a political will to compromise on dispute. So that is what I can't see in the Xi Jinping's way of approaching these questions.
Okay, so the argument is that Mao was in some ways, he could compromise in some of the issues, and there were obviously some disputes, at least on territorial issues, that were, I mean, I wonder, and I would sort of encourage people to think along these lines, like you said, what this means for legitimacy, and how over the years, as particularly territorial disputes became part of national discourse, and became part of identity creation, national identity creation, how that has impacted the leader's ability to compromise also. For example, the potential to compromise on Taiwan today is obviously shrunk, and it's become far more difficult. And that, like you pointed out, is partly because of this process of securitization, and also linked to how the party has pitched its own legitimacy as the entity that is going to undo, or at least not repeat, national humiliation, the idea on. And that sense of compromise has shrunk in all domains. Even when it comes to economic questions, it's become much more difficult. On any of these, I think it's become much more difficult. So I'm not sure how much that is a function of the individual, and I genuinely don't know this, and how much of that is a function of the kind of domestic narrative that was built to generate legitimacy, as well as the changing external environment that China finds itself in, along with its own sense of its power. Because you compromise when you feel that there are shifts in relative power that may not be necessarily favorable to you. So your compromises are to expand your relative power. And today, perhaps Xi Jinping feels he doesn't need to compromise. So that was sort of my first sort of take on that. Secondly, I mean, again, another area of study, because I think you've done really well to try and classify the different ways in which the toolkit that is used, is to think of how, when, and under what circumstances are these different tools deployed? Are these different means deployed? I mean, I remember Hu Jintao talking about Tibet and Xinjiang in early in his tenure, and talking about how, you need to adapt a twofold policy. There has to be security, but there has to come with development also, and you need to, and development will feed into security in Tibet and Xinjiang. And today we are seeing shades of that, but we're seeing much more stronger securitized approach under Xi Jinping. So under what conditions do we see domestically, but also externally, these different tools deployed? Economic coercion with regard to Australia, a different approach with Japan, a very different approach with India. Is it the bilateral circumstances of that relationship, or is it, different understandings of which tools work better, and what are the effectiveness of some of these tools. How effective, for example, it's up for question, right? How effective has China's economic quotient been? It's perhaps been had very limited effect in terms of at least achieving outcomes that they might have imagined. For example, with Australia. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to go to Mr. Buthalingam. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting and stimulating presentation. My question is this, that of course, there is a very visible securitization of China's foreign policy. But is this phenomenon peculiar to China, or is it part of a more global trend, of which China may be a much more visible example, and its tendencies are quite in your face, as it were. But what about other countries? Are they not suspect to this very same phenomenon, maybe in different degree, between, for example, the tension between economic logic and geopolitical logic, and so on? So could it be that the interlaying and interdependent trends in the global situation have accentuated this phenomenon even further? I'd like your views on this. Thank you.
First, I would like to respond to Kevin Ramani. So he was talking about what is that thing that linked to legitimacy and the level of securitization. During the dispute settlements, Ramani sir was asking me to explain the political will, how that is linked to legitimacy. My understanding is during the negotiations with on dispute settlement on any issue, usually it starts with a political resolution, then it goes to the diplomacy, and then come to the agreement, and you delimit the issues. But for that political resolution, the leaders or the co-leadership should be in a position to compromise or assert things. So I was talking about in asserting phase, China has been the China's rise and development in armed forces and even the economic aspects. Assertion angle has been proved, but the with the on the compromise aspect, I don't believe that Xi Jinping has had that much of influence on party to go for compromises in any political resolution. So second thing is about the level of securitization is always dependent on the level of Chinese assessment of level of stability. During the Hong Kong unrest, there was because Hong Kong unrest in the recent past was not the first incident. Previously, also there were incidents of unrest in Hong Kong, but the level has been changed, and maybe it's more about the leadership change. During the previous terms, the leadership was not that willing to act on it, or else second aspect also I see is the foreign interference, whether we agreed or not in Hong Kong. For Chinese reading, it is more than what it was. So the stability has shrunk for Chinese readings. So that means the level of securitization will increase in those areas. So regarding the question by the Ravi sir, actually what one of my point was to explain not China in a very cultural terms, but China as a nation state. China as a nation state, which what we do during the securitization process is, for every state it's normal. You bring legislations, you bring, you strengthen your forces, you engage in diplomacy. I guess it's more of a common phenomenon, which I agree with Visa. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I agree that I think securitization is taking place across different countries, and particularly the fact that you're seeing the national security advisors in January, the India and the American national security advisors met in DC to talk about ISET. And you're having national security advisors talking about technology partnership, tells you a little bit about how securitization has taken place. My only sort of caveat to that would be, I think that China was quite early to this, and a lot of what is taking place today is in part of this. I mean, it's a chicken and egg situation, but a lot of that is taking place today is in response to how Beijing has responded to what it perceived were threats. I'll sort of leave it at that. Sugandha asks, she has two questions. How do China's historical claims intersect with its economic and geopolitical interests in the region? And how does China factor in and then balance these different aspects in its foreign policy decision making? The second question is, how have individuals and interest groups within China themselves responded to these historical claims, and what narratives have they used to support or oppose them?
Regarding the economic link to geopolitical interests or the political questions, if we look at the example of Taiwan as a case, during Ma Ying-jeou, the level of engagement with between China and Taiwan was much greater, higher. But what brought China's economic engagement to low levels was the interest within the younger Taiwanese to go for not to go for this one China policy has made them to act more assertive. So then you can compromise on economic benefits that you're getting from the cordial cross-strait relations. So that is one aspect. And the second one is about how different interest groups behave in foreign policy decision making. One of this, like when I was reading about Chinese South Asian scholars, a book by Rajiv Ranjan he was explaining the South Asian policy of China is it's not run by the Politburo or either the Standing Committee of Politburo. It is mostly those groups which are interested in the relationship with India, that usually the Shanghai fractions, the fractions within the southern areas would influence more like how the policy should go. But if we look at, there is a big north-south divide in China's decision making. How the southern factions see neighboring countries, in the same way the north. But the power, usually the economic power in the party is controlled by the mostly southern factions. The political power and the PLA is kind of mostly by the northern factions. So maybe that's a one way they do it.
All right. Rapai asks, and I think this is more of a comment than a question. Says that I think we need to understand Xi's thinking about the collapse of Soviet communism and his search for finding a safe path for Chinese Communist Party in a new changed world situation. Do you see what's happening currently as anxiety around collapse, Doku?
So actually, I don't see anything near to collapse of China's control over what it considers core and periphery. What I see is about how this idea of squeezed by the other countries like the Quad, this side, and the power asymmetries in Central Asia with Russia and the Indian, what Chinese call it is as Indian dominance in South Asia and Indian Ocean, and ASEAN countries trying to limit China's engagements. So what I see is for China is maybe trying to putting both these the regional aspects and the political questions very near, so that uh, it it creates a sense of understanding between people and the party that both are working for the one goal, that is building our nation stronger and then not having threats that cannot be managed.
All right. I have a slightly different view on this. If I can take a minute, I do think that there is a certain. I mean, if you listen to what happened when Xi Jinping took power in late 2012, and his subsequent speeches and commentaries around the importance of ideology, um, I'm not saying that obviously the Communist Party's grip is loosening and it's anywhere near collapse. I don't believe that, but I do think that that anxiety around the foundations of the party becoming weaker did result in actions, whether those were around, censorship, core socialist values, uh, formation of ideology, corruption, all of that. Which essentially again leads to this sense of siege, and that sense of siege leads to greater securitization. So I do see that there is a sort of link between that. Obviously it's much more complex to draw it out in a brief comment, but I do see some sort of value in this. The only thing that I will add to this is that I think it's also interesting to look at how Chinese discourse around the collapse of the Soviet Union has evolved from the 1990s to today. It went from things being bureaucratic failures to today being to economic fissures, to about things being about self-determination demands by different groups in the Soviet Union, to today being much more around, nobody was man enough to stand up when the party lost its control. So some of that is also quite self-serving in terms of how the Chinese see their own internal environment. Professor Acharya?
Yeah, thanks. So I have an unstable connection, so I won't switch on the video. But yeah, very interesting kind of discussion emerging. I'd like to take off from Ravi's point, essentially, and link it up with both Doku's response and then Manoj's comment on it. So essentially, here is this entire debate on securitization. At one end, we are seeing it as a part of a larger global phenomenon that it's happening in major countries all over. And then when we start to look at that, the contours of the debate within countries, so at one end, where China is concerned specifically, you have raised this issue of concern with legitimization or loss of legitimization, leading to ultimately direst scenario collapse. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum could well be prepare for war. So, so what I'd like to ask you, Doku, is that how do you see this debate within China in terms of these two ends of the spectrum? So, if we've already dealt with the collapse kind of end of argument. Do you, in your readings of what the Chinese are saying, sense that that securitization is also leading to this sense of prepare for war kind of a scenario?
Ma'am, actually, I agree with the first point, the two classification that you have made, the securitization and the legitimization, which is what my research is all about. But the question about people preparing for the war, what my readings from the Chinese scholars suggest is they undermine their preparedness to go for war with certain countries, but with Taiwan, most of the arguments are we are prepared. But with the other nation states, usually as China doesn't consider Taiwan as a separate independent entity, so the approach, the views from Chinese are that we are prepared and then prepared for war, and then we should go for it. But regarding the disputes with India or Japan or Vietnam, South China Sea, the discourse is more about uh, it doesn't come under war, preparing for war, though on ground the realities are different. The Chinese argument is we look towards settling disputes than going for a war. But as if we see the exercises, the using military Malaysia fishing boats to assert China's claims in South China Sea. I guess China is prepared enough to receive any pushback from the other side.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so
It was
much.
just that I just
Sorry,
to stretch that a bit. No, I just want to ask you a clarification because I think I didn't get you quite there. So when I said prepare for war at the other end of the spectrum, it's primarily that from a defensive position, and not so much from an offensive position. And that's how I see the two ends of the spectrum. One is that you have this concern about breaking apart, or you are preparing for an onslaught from outside. So that was, but I get the point you are making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Acharya. Adarsh has a couple of questions. I'll try and put them clearly. In the context of recent aggressive laws being passed, does this represent China's insecurity against the West, particularly the USA, and its capabilities that has implications for China's foreign policy imperatives? Or is this entirely based on insecurity with regard to, say, democracy? The second question is that Adarsh would like to know more about. Adarsh, it would be great if you could explain what you mean by organic ideological basis. So the question is if China's Taiwan responses has any organic ideological basis, or is it just rhetorical, given what the modern day leadership is doing? So I think the first question is sort of something that we've already spoken about. You know, is Beijing securitizing because it feels a threat externally, or internally because of what it sees as, say, political insecurity owing to, say, values and democracy and things like that?
I would like to take the stand that usually a nation state with states thinks about in two cases they go for securitizing. One, when you have unrest within the country, China, in China's case, the periphery situation in the periphery is not so much kind of stability, but so yeah. The second point is about it. There's one saying a professor was saying each state, the idea of the state surviving is to expand, or in that sense, each state think that okay, the other state has the same view of me when we have a dispute. So in the context of US China, in the 40s and 50s, the idea is more about ideological confrontation. Right now, ideology may matters for the domestic audience, but for the external questions, it is about the interests of the state. It's it's ideology is a tool of politics. Politics can majority of the politics happens within the country, but in that angle, maybe the ideological factor is has a base. But in the external context, it is more of interest. What is your interest? So, as China rising to the second stage, uh, there would be a small kind of tensions between the dominant power and the emerging power. So I think we should see the US-China relations from that prism than the issues related to ideology.
All right. And on Taiwan, any thoughts on what is, I mean, is the policy being driven again from an interest perspective on Taiwan, mainland's policy, or is it an ideological viewpoint that is driving it?
So on Taiwan, I don't see ideological aspect being running China's moves, but I see what I see is about the value of historical claim on China to the domestic politics, to the very idea of China coming, the contract between Chinese people and the China, which is about I give you economic benefits, I give you dignity of life, and I will secure this China, like which is what claims of. I'll secure for a longer time. Like that's what. As long as I secure it, you give me the authority to rule you. So that is a basic contract. So Taiwan comes under that contract for me. So I don't think ideology has a factor, but the ideology can be has been a tool to influence some of the sections in Taiwan to attract towards a Chinese position. So that's
All right. Okay. Rapai, your hand is up. In case you'd like to unmute and
Yeah,
ask.
just a comment, Manoj. Actually, when Doku and Alka was talking, this is more to supplement or a sort of question to Doku. You see, the concept of war in China, I think sometimes we carried away with their rhetoric. Their rhetoric is totally different from their real preparedness for the war. And if you go back to Sun Tzu, that, where he states, when they are very near, don't think that they are near. So it is a sort of how they manipulate the security interests. That is why we can see their comments about the Taiwan in relation to US, but at the same time, their preparedness to meet any reality is totally different. So we need to understand the security-related rhetoric and the security-related reality of China. Thank you.
yes, I completely agree with that point.
All right. I have one more comment in the box by Sugandha. It's a long one, so I'm going to try and read it out quickly. The view of other nations regarding China's global dissemination of its political perspectives, or Huayi-Chan, is complex and varies depending on the issue at hand. Some nations see China's engagement in global discourse as a positive development, particularly if it involves constructive efforts to address issues of mutual concern or promote regional stability. Other nations, particularly those who may have different perspectives or interests, view China's efforts to promote its political perspectives as an attempt to assert its influence and challenge the existing global order. I would like to inquire how we as young scholars should view Huayi-Chan. Should we see it as legitimate exercise of China's right to speak out on global issues, or an attempt to assert discourse power and shape the global narrative in its favor?
Yeah, the idea of building narratives to help you stand is always been but it is mostly about the during peacetime. During conflict, how much value does these perspectives have? has been not explored much, and maybe this would be, I think, a good question, but maybe I can work on it. Where how much China's arguments matter during conflict time? So I guess maybe the best example, maybe the one of the good example, maybe the Wolf Warrior diplomacy, which is all about asserting your claims on if somebody contested. So maybe that case could be one, but I don't think we have gone uh, too deep into understanding narratives role in during conflict time.
Right.
During peacetime, it might help to negotiate deals, economic and other uh, deals which China could go with these kind of uh, positive narratives towards China.
All right. So, Sugandha, I have something to add on that, given that I've done some work on this. I mean, look, international relations, geopolitics is an amoral space filled with lots of moral narratives. And the objective of any of these narratives is to create a favorable perception of your interests and your policies and your engagement in a certain region. How should a scholar view at it? I think with deep degree of skepticism. Um, it is an exercise of a certain kind of power. It is an effort to try and build a certain kind of power to achieve the objectives of trying to influence other actors. And every state engages in it, large, small, big, weak, however. And so is Beijing trying to do this. And it has full right to do it, just like anybody else does. How a scholar should view it should be dispassionately, but with certain degree of cynicism. As an Indian, as somebody engaged in Indian policy and looking at Indian interests, I would look at it from the perspective of whether it enhances and supports India's interests. So on climate change, there are areas where Indian and Chinese interests may coincide, particularly when it comes to, say, what we think the West must do. And so in that, I would be very happy to work with Chinese narratives because they coincide with narratives that India believes that are linked to Indian interests. But on other issues, I would find them problematic, particularly on something like, say, right now Xi Jinping has announced the Global Civilization Initiative that talks about, in part, trying to reshape narratives around certain key values, whether those are around freedom, democracy, and so on and so forth. And I think it's important from an Indian point of view to look at whether those narratives are beneficial to the kind of India that we want to develop, to build. So that's how I would look at it. But yeah, as a scholar, I would say, treat everything with skepticism and study it without necessarily getting into a moral dimension of it. I think Adarsh, your hand is up, and I can. I presume you want to have a follow-up to the question that you'd asked. So please go ahead and unmute yourself. Adarsh, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Sir, my question is, I want to know, specifically, since sir is doing his research from Chinese university. So what does common Chinese, the masses, think about war? Are they excited about war, or if they're concerned? What's their psyche regarding war?
Most of my conversation with younger Chinese, where Chinese universities have this policy of a Chinese buddy program where they'll assign 5-6 students to teach them in English, and then they'll teach you in return Chinese. So during the conversation, sometimes issues like this, since I was doing international politics, so I would ask them, so what is the Chinese views. So I want to understand that. So most younger Chinese, particularly when I talk about disputes, is about it's all parties thing. I only bother about my economic situation, me getting job, uh, uh, could be able to buy a flat. Uh, all the things that party is doing, they use the word propaganda. That's why I thought, oh, okay, the Chinese younger generation is more aware of what uh, things are. But on the war, uh, they don't seem to be not much interested. The younger generations, on which with the limited experience which I have, this is what my findings.
Sir, I have a follow-up question regarding that. If if only economy is the main concern of the masses of China, like the basic Chinese, then sir, like if we have to, if Chinese leadership have to choose with which country they want to go in war, will they really go with Taiwan? Like they are so much dependent on Taiwan, or will they choose any other country like India, which might not have a lot of implications as far as life of basic Chinese is concerned?
Yeah, actually, this is good. Because I consider uh, going to conflict with Taiwan or war with on Taiwan sells more for the politicians in China. Uh, and going war with India, maybe it should be the extreme case where the Indian side, before that, there should be um, a kind of social within the society level that to prepare people to pool resources, because during the war what needs to be done is you need to have all your people on one stand, and then second one is to be able to bring pool the resources to go for a conflict. But I guess on the case of Taiwan, China could sell the argument of going for war, but for other countries I don't think uh, the people would buy that argument as at a face value.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Adarsh. If I could just add to that, I think all war has significant economic costs. Whether it is China's, if there is a war on Taiwan or there is a war with India, it will have significant economic costs for China and the Chinese people, and I think they understand it. And I think decisions on this don't happen in a flash. There is, in every case, a sense of mobilization that takes place of not just forces but also narrative. And on Taiwan, what we've seen is that there has been, at least the narrative is much further. That's not to say that there is any imminence to war, but the narrative at least is there is a cocktail that is present on India. Also, I think that over the last 5 years, 6 years, particularly since 2017, we have seen a shift in the narrative. Again, that is not to say that war is imminent, but it's just that the conditions for conflict and the narrative for conflict exist. Those need to be sharpened over a period of time as things develop. If obviously the decision to go to war has to be taken, but that decision, I mean, nothing today tells us that that is happening, and none of those decisions, even for the Chinese leadership, are going to be taken without due consideration to the significant cost that will be borne. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take them. If not, I have one final question for Doku. So I'm going to just give people the opportunity to raise their hand for the next 10-15 seconds. If not, I can have one final question. Okay, so Doku, I think to just end this conversation, it's been quite fascinating. My final question to you is essentially around India, and what do you see as the impact of this overall securitization that's taking place in terms of the future of the India-China relationship? Are we likely to see much more volatility because this prism of security dominance, or are we likely to see potentially, you said already Xi Jinping is not the kind of guy who compromises. So are we likely to see it become much more difficult for this relationship to arrive at some sort of a new equilibrium?
So, as I said, I don't find any argument or any evidences that she would go for compromise, being a core leader. But if he could articulate it in a Chinese, that going for compromise was good. I haven't seen that way of putting things from Xi Jinping's speeches or anywhere. So that is one thing. And what securitization on the Chinese border has an impact on India? For that question, I see if the other side is preparing more, so our side would try to securitize, or not just securitize, defend our areas under our control. So this would raise the level of preparedness on the both the sides. It could work as a balance, because since the both prepared well to put a kind of big loss on other side, because if we have a conflict, it doesn't mean that, okay, if somebody is winning, both would be taking the cost, like huge cost. So I think that could work as an equilibrium, but if that balance loses, maybe in that case, the one side may go for asserting, go for a campaign.
All right, thanks so much. I see Ambassador Rana's hand up. Ambassador Rana, please go ahead. So you're on mute, sir.
So you're.
Sorry, you're still on mute. I'm going to try and.
Yeah.
So you're still on mute, sir.
Yeah, I'm now. I think I can be heard now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I joined the discussion very late. My apologies. But I do have a little bit of a question mark over the word securitization as applied to foreign policy. And I fear that this word is somewhat overused quite often. Just now, Mr. Rao referred to securitization of the border. Now, excuse me, but that doesn't really make sense, because the border is part of a line of security. A border is the external frontier of the country. So when you say you are securitizing it, well, you mean, are you sending lots of troops there? Are you engaging in threatening actions? If so, why not say it plainly and openly? This tendency to deploy words as if any word can fit in any context creates a little bit of a problem for me. But that apart, and I shall carefully watch the recording of this session in order to educate myself. But it seems to me that the crux of the issue is that China is now using the border as a means of exerting pressure on India. Why not say that in plain language? Why not say using the border as a means of pressure? But securitization is a very fancy term for me and somewhat unclear. Now, this begs a much deeper question. Just suppose the India-China border had been settled in some fashion at some point in the past. Would that have deprived our neighbor with very large ambitions from nevertheless using the border as a point where incidents could be created and pressure applied as per the wishes of the regime in power. I'm a little confused on that, and I have discussed this with a few friends who are of the view that, oh yes, if the border issue had been settled, there would be no difficulty over the border. Is that really so in relations between states? I ask this question with a little bit of naivety, and I beg your forgiveness for the simplicity of my question. Thank you very much.
Rana sir, actually, sorry, but it was a tongue slip, but it was not what I intended to. In the context of India-China border, I corrected my word with defending the border, because border needs to be defended. Rather, securitization over there in the borders doesn't feel suits to me also. But I was talking securitization in the sense of combining all the 5 historical claims China has and which have been contested by various countries. So to give an overall picture, then I was talking about securitization. But regarding the border, it is more of defending your line, what are your positions. So for defense, we need different measures. To securitize, you need different measures. Defending is with the armed forces. Securitization can happen in many ways and means. So that's what in one of the slides I explained what are the ways and means China approach this process. So this is the overall one. The second thing is about um, um, you talk about the third one is about uh, settling of, if hypothetically if the border has been settled, would we be having the same problems? Or for me, the answer is lies in what the society is about. Usually when we have a neighbor, um, any neighbors, the relations between neighbors is somewhat kind of, when you are in a good mood, good interest with both each other, things go smooth. When you may have some kind of not border issues, but other issues, economic issues, or any other issue, you going with US or China, being with Russia, um, or maybe the neighbors like Pakistan. If China and Pakistan were having are having good relations, even after the strategic relations, the level of strategic relations that they have right now, if that is there, India would naturally uh, uh, try to push. If the same happens with India and Vietnam, the another neighbor, which is not the neighbor like China, maybe trying to maybe it tries to push and tell what's India's place is in the regional order. So I guess I think the neighbors law works on this one. So usually even the Nepal, Bangladesh. uh, Right now we thought the last um, in the last maybe 5 years, we thought the border is settled, but we have a lot of issues happening in the Nepal, where there's a new claims coming. So I think neighbors maybe naturally have this one to uh, envy each other, and then maybe in sometimes go along with each other. So I think it depends on the time and the context of the issue.
Thank you so much, Toku. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rana, for that intervention and that question. I think what you've posed is a very difficult counterfactual to answer. I think that the impact of the settlement of the boundary dispute, would it have eliminated all friction? I don't think so. But would it have reduced potential for conflict? Yes. would it also, I think one also needs to think about what it would have, whenever the boundary dispute would have been settled, what it would have done to, and in what manner it would have been settled, what it would have done in terms of political trust on both sides, and therefore economic engagement and other forms of engagement, and what sort of a relationship, therefore, we would have qualitatively as a whole. Could a state still, use your forces to coerce? Yes. But I think it might have, depending on when, where, and how that dispute would have been settled, it might have created a very different overall relationship, which would have perhaps, at least been better than where we are today. Recognizing the fact that it was a difficult dispute to resolve anyway. I think we're anyway out of time also. I want to hand over to Supradeep, and I want to thank Doku, and I want to thank everybody for participating in this conversation and asking your questions and sharing your thoughts. Supradeep, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, sir. So with this, we will wrap up the session, and we thank all the panelists for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS the next Wednesday seminar. We at the ICS conduct seminars every Wednesday. Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to our newsletters for regular updates. Thank you, everyone.